adult lifetime, and even in the last few years, senior police officers engaging in public political debate, almost to the point of becoming, at times, party political. It's almost as if they think they should write the laws and enforce them as well. And there are dangers. There are dangers with that. There are dangers with any of us saying, "I'm not a police chief, and therefore I don't have something to say about what is proportionate. What is proportionate in terms of the rights and freedoms we give up in order to achieve some level of protection."
It has always been the case that the police have communicated their concerns about police evidence gathering, about laws which stand in their way of dealing with crime. It's quite appropriate that the police should express those concerns to government, isn't it?
I think that the way in which those concerns are expressed and the extent to which they're expressed is really important. I'm concerned when senior police officers are too often in the media debating people like me or debating politicians when they appear on Question Time, for example, on the BBC. And the worst example, I think, of this that I've ever seen was around the debate that we had about 90-day pre-charge detention in terror trials, where one political party, the government party, was in favour, other parties were against. The proposal itself, by the way, was born not in government, but born initially in a press release issued by the Association of Chief Police Officers. Not a private advisory conversation with the Home Secretary, which is perfectly legitimate and necessary, but by political campaigning on the part of the police. And this this culminated in police officers in and out of uniform, lobbying on national television and lobbying in Parliament, briefing, wobbling backbenchers to get them to vote for a particular proposal. That is dangerous in a democracy.
Well, let's come to 90-day detentions in a minute, but to stay with DNA databases for a second, I can see an argument here that a universal database, for example, sampling the DNA of every child born in the country, would respond to some of your reasonable concerns about discrimination, about racial profiling, and would provide the police with a catchment of DNA that would enable them to solve crimes. How can you possibly disagree with that as a civil libertarian?
Well, equal treatment is an important principle, and I say that this is about proportionality. And to take the DNA of every man, woman and child in the country is to take some pretty intimate material about them that can have pretty serious consequences outside the crime prevention.
If you're guilty.
No, not just if I may, not just if you're guilty. This DNA reveals your parenthood, your true parenthood, not the parenthood you always thought you had. This DNA says things about your health possibilities in the future, makes you more or less insurable. This DNA could affect you in the criminal context, not just if you're guilty, but if there's human error in the management or regulation or access to.
So we need safeguards.
So no, we don't. One of the safeguards, if I may say so, is having a proportionate database, in saying that everyone doesn't need to be a DNA suspect, that those who've been convicted of offences of the appropriate gravity should be on this database. You've
already said a number of times now that though you may be open to persuasion on some of these issues in terms of the scope of proportionality or the cost-benefit analysis in terms of privacy laws and other concerns as a civil libertarian, you are not open to persuasion on the notion of torture. Well, as you know, it's an old chestnut argument, but there is the ticking bomb defence that has reared its head again in recent comments, in fact, by the Lord Chief Justice, where he appears to say, Lord Phillips, that though torture could never be justified in law, strictly in law, one could understand in a scenario where a suspect is captured who may have evidence that would reveal the location of a nuclear bomb, that person, if they were tortured under the directions of the state authorities, one could forgive the executive in that context, though one could not legally justify what the executive did. When somebody is tortured, it isn't by a thing called the executive, it's by another human being, whether they were just following orders or not. It doesn't happen enough in authoritarian politics to make a distinction
between personal morality and ethics. And these dilemmas and arguments which will go on for as long as people live, and what the law should be in a democracy and how best to construct the constitution and the law of a democracy. And you have to have that personal ethical space, because you have to have people who challenge the law and even in extremis disobey it. That is the principle. I say that the law, all the politics that ever countenances legitimising torture, has essentially allowed the whole house of cards that we call democracy and human rights to fall down. Now, if you put to me the infamous ticking bomb scenario that has been debated by people for the centuries and has never arisen, but if you want to put it to me as a hypothetical, I won't run away from it, and I'll say this. In truth, if it were really true that you had the knowledge of where the nuclear bomb was and I had you alone in a room with me, I don't know what I would do. I don't know, but I'll say this, that the law should prohibit me torturing you. And if I, in that moment, make a decision that is contrary to law, I will have to take my chances with a jury.
They wouldn't convict you.
So be it. But the law that countenances, the law that legitimises it, and as has been suggested by some people in the United States, the law that says, well, perhaps we should have judicial warrantry. Perhaps we should, in that scenario, have an application to a judge who says, well, maybe a little bit of torture, maybe just 1 or 2 toenails, maybe just X volts of electricity.
War is a very different moral scenario. There are things that are permitted in war that would not normally be permitted, like, for example, assassination or killing can be a legitimate thing to do for a state in a just war. You're not a pacifist, are you? I'm
not a pacifist, no.
So you would support killing and assassination within the context of a just war? I
would say that the generation that sat down after the Second World War, people slightly to the left of politics, slightly to the right, Eleanor Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, etc., people of all faiths and none, who settled on this human rights framework that drew on the best traditions of all civilizations around the world, they got it right. And I think it is right to examine, as you're doing, why torture is worse even than killing.
But by giving me that
I'll tell you why it's worse than killing. I'll tell you why it's worse
than killing.
It's worse than killing. To torture someone, that is what they found, and that, I think, is something that resonates in our humanity.
How could it possibly be worse than killing?
I'm not a vegetarian. I'm not a vegetarian. Maybe I should be. I'm not a vegetarian. But I would teach my son not to torture animals. He can sit there eating his chicken nuggets, but if I saw him torturing an animal,
I would choose torture over death, wouldn't you?
When you take somebody else's life, whether in war as a state or whether in another circumstance, you do something quite cataclysmic. You play God, but when you torture them, you play something quite different. And I think the point is that yes, you debase their humanity and inflict a pain and suffering on them that is possibly even. We will all die one day. We will. You've ended. You've chosen that. No, let me just finish the point. But listen, we will all die one day, and to have that moment chosen by another human being is pretty awful. But we will all die one day. But we aspire to death with a certain amount of dignity and without too much lingering suffering and pain. And when you torture someone, you therefore do something far worse that people don't have to expect, like death. And when you torture someone, you degrade not just their humanity, but your own, and you take away something from wider society. And the society that countenances torture is the heart of darkness. But my view is that one of the, part of the litmus of a civilized and progressive society is that we will have debates about these issues, but the currency will go up and not down. And that has broadly, until the war on terror, by the way, in our discourse, that was largely the way that it was going, so that all over Europe, people were moving away from saying that it's about organ failure or not, and saying, well, actually, slopping out in a prison cell is degrading treatment, and beating your children is inhuman and degrading treatment. So, and you know what? I believe this is a blip. It's a very unpleasant blip in human history, but I agree with Martin Luther King that in the end, you know, the arc of history bends towards justice.